So Detention Empire opens with two interwoven stories. One is of a hunger strike at a California detention facility in 2017. In the desert outside of Los Angeles, Adelanto is one of the largest in the US and run by for-profit operator, the Geo Group. Began by 9 men who are part of a Central American refugee caravan that arrived at the US-Mexico border in search of asylum. The hunger strike met brutal retaliation, assault, solitary confinement, and for some, deportation. The story is a microcosm of cycles of resistance and retaliation and detention that have played out over and over across decades and continue today. A coalition of actors inside Adelanto and allies on the outside also introduces connections between Caribbean and Central American asylum-seeking groups who have faced exceptional discrimination in the system since the 1980s, and questions about the role and impacts of activism on the outside. The book also opens with another story, my own. The same month I was accepted to a PhD program at UC Irvine in 2007, my former husband was detained in a for-profit facility in New Jersey and then soon deported. For me, studying the history of detention has always been very personal. At first, I set out to tell the story of the rise of private prisons in the 1980s and why they first emerged in an immigration context. I first consulted government archives to seek a top-down understanding of the US's embrace of detention. But as I researched, I also began to work with people facing deportation, and I found a larger story. I encountered patterns of resistance and retaliation from the 1980s that mirrored my own witnessing in real time in the 2010s. I was struck by how repetitive these patterns are across time and place, how central a perceived threat of migration from the Caribbean and Central America was in what I call the Reagan imaginary. I saw a pattern of official lies emerge, and I saw how detention was a site of solidarity and resistance, but also of silence. Over the last 4 decades, migrant detention rates in the US have increased 1,000-fold to reach a height of 55,000 people detained per day in 2020. Although the COVID pandemic curbed detention numbers, which are again rising, it's worsened already horrific conditions in detention, sparking a new wave of hunger strikes and a growing movement to abolish ICE. Although abusive conditions in detention continue to make headlines, they also always seem to recede into a business as usual background. Interrogating how and why this is so was a central impetus for writing this book. Detention Empire zeroes in on the early 1980s as a critical turning point in the history of immigration enforcement and the rise of mass incarceration. As a formative event known as the Mariel Cuban boat lift, a large-scale migration of 125,000 Cubans to South Florida during the summer of 1980, alongside increasing arrivals of Haitian and Central American asylum seekers, galvanized new modes of covert warfare in the Reagan administration's globalized war on drugs. A central argument of the book is that detention operates as a form of counterinsurgency at the intersections of US foreign policy and domestic prison trends. I trace how the Reagan administration developed a set of retaliatory enforcement measures enacted in specific response to these 3 asylum-seeking groups, and that laid foundations of new forms of carceral and imperial expansion. These new enforcement measures included the systematic detention of asylum seekers, drug and immigrant interdiction programs, the militarization of a more broadly imagined US border, and prison privatization. Counterinsurgent or counter-revolutionary warfare has a long racialized history in the United States. It's deeply embedded in US foreign policy and interventions in Latin America, which have shaped contemporary migration patterns. As historians have shown, the US's embrace of counterinsurgency not only enforces a post-war global capitalist order, but has also underwritten prison and policing trends at home. In the book, I define empire as the state's commission of transnational violence in order to sustain itself. This violence has taken many forms, including war or covert war and political violence, poverty via labor and economic coercion, race, sex, and gender-based violence, ecocide, and theft of indigenous land and sovereignty. As multitudes of violence set in motion by histories of US imperialism manifest in scales of mass migration, detention exacts violence on the scale of migrant bodies. It is, to use Greg Grandin's phrase, empire's workshop, a place where the violent ends of empire are reified and then rendered invisible. The book challenges two popular misconceptions about the Reagan administration. First, that it was soft or softer on immigration than subsequent administrations. And second, that Reagan's right turn faced little public protest. Reading beyond government archives that tell an official story that justifies state violence and casts migrations and social movements as a threat, I also draw on community-created unofficial archives, protest artifacts, and oral histories to show how migrants resisted repression at every turn. Throughout the 80s, people in detention and allies on the outside, including legal advocates, Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, and the Central American peace and sanctuary movements, organized hunger strikes, caravans, and uprisings to counter detention's silencing effects. Over time, intertwining US settler, colonial, and imperial projects have laid foundations of what I call the carceral palimpsest. Palimpsest is a term in textual and architectural studies referring to inscriptions of new writing or design practices over old ones that still remain visible, and is a helpful concept for understanding prisons and imprisonment as episodic reinscriptions of white nationalist state-making, layered atop one another as old and new features fuse and function across detention sites. At heart, resistance and retaliation in detention is a battle over truth. In writing the book, I was inspired by James Scott and Robin D.G. Kelly's concept of hidden transcripts of resistance, which show how grassroots organizing shapes decision-making at the top levels of government. As protests from detention, amplified by inside, outside, and coalition organizing, met increasing state retaliation, new enforcement policies were accompanied by a prose of counterinsurgency meant to obscure the impacts of US foreign policy and silence opposition. Few presidents are better known for their masterful rhetoric and ability to define themselves in opposition to their enemies as Ronald Reagan. As governor of California from 1967 to 1975, Reagan developed a revanchist politics in response to civil rights, student, anti-war, and labor movements. In the White House, the Reagan administration drew upon these prior battles to wage a new war on migrant rights. Reagan touted the US as a beacon of freedom that embraced refugees fleeing communism, while at the same time giving nods to vigilante violence in the borderlands and US-backed Central American civil wars. Reagan's targeting of the Caribbean basin, a region he dubbed the US's third border, strategically merged immigration control with criminal and communist threats, Cold War geopolitical strategy, and exploitative neoliberal free trade agreements. Anti-Blackness and homophobia surrounding Cuban and Haitian migrants especially also converged with Reagan's dog whistle signaling on race, deviance, and crime that predominantly targeted African Americans. The Mariel Cuban migration took on mythic proportions as this singular event became an enduring symbol of crisis, shaping policy even through the Trump administration. As Reagan's associate attorney general, Rudy Giuliani was an architect of new detention policies that hastened crimmigration trends, including the administration's 1982 Mass Immigration Emergency Plan, tailored to a, quote, Mariel-type scenario, and further justified by increasing arrivals of Haitian, quote, boat people and Central American feet people. This preemptive contingency plan for establishing detention space for 10 to 20,000 migrants in the event of a migration crisis would serve as a blueprint for detention building across the US Sunbelt and beyond. Piecing together hidden transcripts, Detention Empire connects landscapes of resistance against Reagan across detention sites. Detained Cuban, Haitian, and Central American migrants wielded their bodies and voices to reclaim freedom and hold the state accountable for its abuses. Personal and collective protests took many forms, from letter writing, petitions, to class action lawsuits, to creating alternate worlds through art, song, and poetry, to coordinating hunger strikes and riotous unrest. In 1987, Mariel Cuban, subjected to years of indefinite detention, staged a takeover and standoff at 2 prisons in Atlanta and Louisiana, spanning 15 days, the longest prison uprising in US history. Ongoing resistance created pressure within detention, while transnational solidarity activism opposing Reagan's foreign policies drew connections between conditions of confinement and global freedom struggles. This was seen in US-Cuba student solidarity formations and advocacy on behalf of queer and trans Mariel Cubans detained on US military bases, in the feminist collective Off Our Backs, which supported Haitian women on hunger strike in facilities across the country, or in Salvadoran and Guatemalan refugee caravans and speech acts mobilized by the sanctuary movement. Along with masterminding new immigration policies, Giuliani also played a pivotal role in developing retaliation measures and counterinsurgent rhetoric aimed at neutralizing Reagan's opponents. After a hunger strike at the Chrome detention facility in Miami, for example, that drew international attention, coalitional protests led by civil rights leader Jesse Jackson prompted the INS to call in the Bureau of Prisons to help form a militarized Border Patrol Tactical Unit, or BORTAC for short. While Giuliani directed the INS and the FBI to monitor outside agitators, these scripts would play out again on a larger scale as these agencies harassed and prosecuted Central American peace and sanctuary activists, aided by Reagan's issuance of Executive Order 12333, which legalized domestic surveillance in support of national foreign policy objectives abroad. Giuliani continued to monitor internal and public communications surrounding detention, refuting migrant and allied accounts of abuses. Traveling to Haiti, he even forged diplomatic relations with Francois Duvalier's regime to lay the groundwork for the Haitian interdiction program and justify the US's blanket rejection of Haitian asylum seekers. The mounting protests from detention and the sanctuary movement raised such alarm with the Reagan administration is instructive, both as a cautionary tale, but also for its abolitionist potential. As I researched Detention Empire, I began working with communities to document, archive, and mobilize stories that defy prisons and borders, and the prose of counterinsurgency that sustains them. Coalitional efforts to document abuse and reverse erasure are crucial for building power and reckoning with the enduring xenophobia driving detention policies today. However, recovering and documenting stories may not always be enough. As a movement tactic, storytelling has been critiqued for lacking historical context or contributing to narratives of victimization or deservingness and sustaining neoliberal agendas. Indeed, some of the most radical critiques of the sanctuary movement came from within. I want to end with the words of Alejandro Rodriguez, a labor organizer who experienced torture at the hands of US-backed death squads. He fled El Salvador with his family to enter sanctuary in Rochester, New York. Speaking from sanctuary in 1985, he described a desire to deepen the work until the movement becomes more aware of itself and its people, with a real expression of its historic roots. Others living in sanctuary also urged allies to see it as a process of political education and of learning to make way for migrant voices and leadership. Detention Empire asks, what can grow from seeds of resistance already planted and their interconnecting roots? I conclude that to end detention and its abuses, different conceptions of migration are necessary, aided by abolition feminist and critical refugee studies scholarship that rejects the premise of state sovereignty and foregrounds migrant journeys and life worlds as sites of critique, decolonization, and reparation. Stories from detention expose cracks in the architecture of detention itself, placing them alongside one another across time and place to build solidarity across groups and contexts can dismantle its foundational logic in its entirety. These visions are not new. As Alejandro Rodriguez concluded, the sanctuary movement must take the next step, which is a historic step, to forge an anti-investment solidarity movement. Ultimately, he was asking US audiences to divest from complicity and empire in all its forms.